We'll continue to hold just a moment as others get logged in. For those of you already on the webinar, we will be recording today's webinar as always, and we will make the recording available after the recording ends and it's approved. We'll also, with approval from Gautam, we'll make his slides available to anyone as a PDF, particularly on the UBBA membership. And it's about 2 minutes after the hour. I suspect, Gautam, that we will have other people joining a little bit later.
Okay.
And that's okay. Like I said, with the recording, that helps us make sure we can catch people up. But for all of you on, thank you very much for joining. I'm Bobby Harris. I'm the Executive Director of the Utility Broadband Alliance. And as with all of our member webinars, we are thrilled that we have members who are willing to share their knowledge, members who have been in the utility industry and particularly in the utility telecommunications infrastructure industry for quite a long time and willing to share their insights and knowledge with all of you free of charge. So it's with that that I would like to turn it to Gautam Talagery from Ericsson. Gautam has been a great friend of the Alliance. He has shared and educated us on many different topics. Today, we are going to look at IoT solutions and IoT technologies over private LTE. And Gautam, I'm just going to get out of your way, my friend, and let you take us through your deck and share your topic today.
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. Thanks for the opportunity for allowing us to provide a perspective on how IoT technologies bring flexibility and coverage to private LTE. I'm Gautam Talagery. I'm responsible for solutions at Ericsson and privileged to be a part of this organization and this industry. So jumping straight in, cellular IoT is something which has been increasingly picked up by the industry now for multiple reasons. There is the traditional mobile broadband that you and me and everyone use. We got our smartphones, we look at YouTube, and we use mobile broadband to a very large extent, very much a part of our life. IoT is where the networks talk to devices, which can vary in their traffic model. And in the perspective of utilities, of course, we got different traffic models. We are starting with serving of the smart grid. And in serving the smart grid, there is the need for intelligence. To begin with, we establish a data bearer, and then we start analyzing what those connections look like, what the traffic patterns are that's used to make the network more intelligent and more focused towards the use cases that we want to execute. And that's where the data-driven, the artificial intelligence, the machine learning, all that becomes a part of it. So that's where private LTE is headed, or cellular technologies are headed. And within cellular, we got different flavors. And the flavors are what you see on the screen here. Massive IoT is where you got lots and lots of devices out there which need an internet connection. They may not be consuming too much of traffic, but they are massive in terms of volumes. So massive IoT is not very latency sensitive. You get maybe 100 milliseconds is good to a large extent. So these low-cost devices are the first set of devices that are addressed by private LTE. Then we start getting into inspection of towers, inspection of the grid, using drones, for example. So that is you're still talking to machines, but you're now starting to talk to video cameras hanging on machines. You're starting to talk about traffic models that have a high rate of throughput. You're beginning to look at devices that need a megabit or more per second, maybe 2 or 3 megabits per second, as compared to massive IoT, which probably consumed about 50 to 100 kilobits per second. So that's the next part of it. Then it starts getting interesting. You want to catch a falling conductor and that avoids a wildfire. So you got a very short time window to detect and react. And for that, it is now getting to critical IoT. And to get to critical IoT, we are probably looking at latencies of the order of maybe 10 milliseconds or lesser. And when you get to that level of responsiveness in the network, you're starting to now bridge between 4G and 5G technologies. And I'll give a perspective on what 5G brings. But either you bring the user plane to the edge of the network so that your responsiveness is quick, or you get into an update to the technology and go towards some of the capabilities that 5G brings in. And so that's where critical IoT comes in. And the last pillar that you see here, industrial automation, this is where we are talking about controlling machinery on a shop floor, on an industry floor. You got automated robots who are moving around the shop floor. You need to control them with real low latency, and that's the time-sensitive networking becomes an important part. And what we see here is that utilities here. Let me see if I can get my highlighter here. There's a pointer. Okay. So utilities right here. We have a need for all four verticals here. We focus on the first two to begin with. The first one in the short term, the next in the medium term, and then we start getting into the others going forward. So please type in your questions in the chat, and Bobby will bring them up towards the end. So now let's see the users. Now LPWA, low power wide area, and low power wide area networks are some of the solutions that are already existing in the industry. The low power wide area technologies in the 4G arena are the four that we looked at, and we'll get into some of those details now. So of course, 2G and 3G has been around for a while. They've been powering a lot of devices out there. We are now getting into the how 4G can step in as 2G and 3G networks get retired as they go into sunset. LTE has to pick up on that, and that's where this second part here is. And then we transition into the next part. And you see here that what GSM or HSPA was providing before is what NB-IoT and CAT-M over LTE is going to start providing. And you'll note that this arrow goes across 4G and 5G. That's because NB-IoT and CAT-M is built for working under a 5G umbrella also. Consolidation of use cases between the two is what brings in the transition from 4G to 5G. So here is an analysis. So it's of course got a lot of numbers in there, but what I'd like to highlight is that the things that we normally watch out for when it comes to choice of technology. So it's all about we got these three. We got CAT-M, we got NB-IoT, and we got traditional LTE. Depending on the use case, which one should I pick? It depends on what we want to use it for. So let's say we want mobility. We want to have limited mobility, like for example, the classic example of a drone, or that's for the medium term. In the short term, you got something like mission critical push to talk, which is picking up on LMR. So when you want to work with something like push to talk, mission critical push to talk, you might probably default towards LTE. You might have some devices that require some limited amount of mobility from all the meters are not going to move around. There might be some devices that need the burst of throughput. And that's where CAT-M1 becomes an option. The other point of discussion here often is the throughputs that you're looking at. Now, we talked about devices that are working with a couple of 100 kilobits per second. So from that perspective, NB-IoT could serve most of those devices. And so then the difference between NB-IoT and LTE comes to the other aspect that becomes important, which is that if I want to reach a meter that's in a basement, if I've got a base station that's blasting away at a decent level amount of power in the uplink, you can still connect to that meter that's sitting in the baseband in the basement. But if you use something like NB-IoT, you'll see in the subsequent slides that as a technology, NB-IoT is built for deeper penetration into foliage, into buildings. So when it comes to choosing the same, couple of 100 kilobits per second, you have a choice between LTE or NB-IoT. And now, if you want to occasionally update that meter or that device, which is sitting deep inside, you might need something like CAT-M, because CAT-M then provides for a throughput of maybe 1.1 meg in the uplink and 500 kilobits in the downlink. These are theoretical capabilities. They probably have about half the speed when it comes to a realistic deployment. So now you compare the first line and the second line, and both these are similar in their capability to penetrate into a building. The difference is the speed, and you'll see another difference in terms of the bandwidth that's occupied. So then the next thing we talk about is how much bandwidth do we have available. If you are working with 3 or 5 megahertz of spectrum, fitting a 200 kilohertz carrier is easy, relatively easy, right? It doesn't take much space. You take a 1.4 megahertz carrier and you put it into a 3 or a 5 megahertz carrier, there's some part of the capacity that has now got consumed. And I can, to address an important clarification here, these technologies can run in parallel. So it's not like I put my CAT-M in there and it hogs the bandwidth all the time. If the CAT-M traffic is not active, LTE traffic is in use, and you'll see that on the subsequent slide. So there are many different knobs here on how you choose, one of the three technologies. And LoRa and Sigfox are, of course, the existing LPWAN technologies out there, which are slowly getting replaced with LTE-based technologies, and the ones here. So moving on to this. Now, this is where you got a different level of comparison here. Let me explain the picture on the left here. So an LTE carrier can range in size depending on how much of spectrum you have. You have 1.4 megahertz as one standardized configuration. You got 3 megahertz as the next one. So 1.4, 3, 5, 10, 20, and you might have 15 also in between. So those are some of the standardized blocks of spectrum that you use for LTE. And as you assign more spectrum to something, you get more performance, and performance as measured in terms of throughput or speed. So 1.4 to 20, it changes, depending on how much you have available. So now let's say you got a 3 or a 5 megahertz amount of LTE spectrum. When you put a CAT-M carrier in the middle of that, you can now run LTE and CAT-M simultaneously. The CAT-M is talking to the CAT-M devices, the LTE is talking to the LTE devices. If there's no CAT-M that's active, if there's no traffic going on towards the CAT-M device, then that 1.4 megahertz, most of it gets used for LTE. It's sort of a real-time CAT-M pops up, does its thing, and goes away. There's an overhead, about 20% of overhead, which is always there, but for most part, the LTE spectrum is available for use if CAT-M is not active. traffic is not active. NB-IoT is also similar. You got LTE running, you got NB-IoT traffic. The carrier delivers traffic over the NB-IoT channel, and then the LTE continues using the rest of it. There's of course the possibility that you could mix all the three in, but then then you got to do some math. You got to do some math to figure out on how much of capacity is occupied by CAT-M, how much is occupied by NB-IoT, how much is left for LTE. Is it worth mixing all of them together, or should you deploy it in such a way that you have NB-IoT going on one sector and you got CAT-M going on a different sector? Or it's a question of deployment. There's some thought that has to be put into use of limited spectrum and use of resources on that limited spectrum. That's the picture on the left. The picture on the right, you got coverage along the x-axis, you got performance along the y-axis, and you got a relative comparison of how you see that this is regular coverage, and then CAT-M has a little lesser performance in LTE because it's got lesser spectrum. I mean, it's 1.4 megahertz as compared to 3, 5, 10, 15, 20 for LTE. So it's got a deeper penetration, deeper coverage, but lesser performance as measured in throughput. And then NB-IoT with 200 kilohertz is only so much of speed you can get out of that. So the performance is lower, but then you got a deeper level of coverage with NB-IoT. So this is another determining factor in how you work with a trade-off between capacity and coverage, and that's how you would pick one over the other. And here is the question then is, okay, you got LTE, the difference at the high level is you got different amount of spectrum. You got 200 kilohertz for NB-IoT, you got 1.4 for CAT-M, you got 3, 5, 7, 3, 5, 10, 15 for LTE. The reason why the LPWA technologies like NB-IoT and CAT-M are able to penetrate deeper is because they got this concept of retransmissions. So you send the data once, the device may or may not get all the packets. You realize that the device is in a low coverage area, as in it's high, it's long distance away from the base station. So you might repeat the message, repeat it a couple of times. Because the device is using NB-IoT, it gathers the different packets, brings it together, and with that, because of repetitions, you're able to reach the device over a period of time. So that's what this is. Receiving decide combines multiple transmissions to decode data. So that's what makes the difference between the white circle here and the brownish circle on the outside, because you're able to go deeper since you have this flexibility to retransmit. And then depending on which mode you're in, you might be repeating up to 32 times, or maybe more than 1,000 times if you're in a different mode. And as all of y'all in the area of IP know, when you have retransmissions, your effective throughput drops. So the low throughput that you get from NB-IoT is lower if you retransmit. So that's another aspect. You got to plan your network so that you avoid retransmissions if you want to keep your throughput at a decent level. But if you're in a rural area and throughput is not such a big deal for you, then maybe you can deal with a few extra repetitions and lower throughput. So that's another aspect here. So moving to the next one here. So when we put all this together, some of the other drivers, the business drivers, right? So we talked about technology. So if you look at the business drivers, the price point for devices or the price point for modules in NB-IoT and Cat-M are very different than LTE. They are much cheaper. You got other aspects to the technology where the NB-IoT and Cat-M devices go into sleep on purpose. That's how it's designed. So you're not on all the time. You go to sleep. That's the discontinuous transmission, DRX. That's another way by which you're able to bring the battery the battery life goes up to like 10 years. Is rated for 10 years. Cat-M devices are operating at a higher throughput. So even though you have this capability of having a higher battery life, because you're using that higher throughput, your battery consumption might increase. And so very often Cat-M devices are sort of plugged into the wall. They have a power source. NB-IoT devices are the cheaper devices. They stand alone. You sort of forget about them, and then you go back in 10 years and replace them, I guess. Then you see this graphic here. So this little area here is mobile broadband, the smartphones, consumer traffic. You start repeating stuff. You start sending devices. So you start sending retransmissions. You use some of the concepts of NB-IoT that allow for deeper coverage. And now you got, in technical terms, you got a 20 dB improvement in your link budget, which stretches the cell edge. And because these devices are optimized in their resource consumption, you're able to put millions of devices onto a network as compared to maybe tens of thousands when it comes to smartphones. So here's some logic. There are two takeaways from this. One is that LTE module costs have evolved over the years. You had Cat4, so Cat4 is a couple of megabits. Cat1 comes to approximately a meg. And then Cat-M is about half a megabit in the downlink and about a meg in the uplink under perfect conditions. And NB-IoT is, of course, a couple of hundred kilobits per second. So with all this, as the devices get less complex, their price points go down. On the next slide, I'll show you what has changed to make them cheaper and simplified. The graphic on the top shows a forecast for where we see device prices going, and right there you'll see a driver for NB-IoT, which is the brownish line at the bottom, and you see LTE, the slowest version of LTE, Cat1, that's at the top here. So starting at 18 bucks, here is around 8, and here it's around 3. So 3, 8, and 15, 17, dropping down to sub $10. But you see that the price of NB-IoT and Cat-M are much lower than LTE, and that's another driver for moving towards those IoT technologies. So here's how simplification is occurred. Just an example. This device on the top here, you got 2 RX and 1 TX. So you're doing a traditional minimal is you got at least 2 transmit paths from the base station towards the radio, towards the device. So your smartphone is receiving 2 receive paths. It's sending on 1 transmit path. It's got IMS, it's got memory, and we got all our photos and videos and all that loaded on the device. And you got an expensive device. So now you start cutting back. You start getting rid of one receive path. Right? You cut it down to 1 receive path. You simplify your baseband. You cut down on your memory. Forget about IMS. You're not going to have a smart grid device that's talking. So IMS could probably be removed. So with all this, the transition from a multi-megabit smartphone that we use on a minute by minute basis. We go down to Cat-M and NB-IoT with a much more simplified architecture. And so we reduce the TX power, reduce the peak rate, and with all this, we have probably a 90% module cost reduction. So that drives, that's one of the reasons why an LP WAN technology is easier to roll out, because you got cheaper devices, higher volumes, and you can address multiple use cases with that. So let's see how we're doing on time, half an hour more. So here is another comparison, since we're talking of choosing between technologies. The numbers here are the theoretical numbers. You're smelling the antenna, you're in perfect RF conditions, you got some pretty decent speeds here. 5 meg and 5 meg in the uplink, 10 meg in the downlink, taking an example of LTE 3 megahertz. Realistically, in medium signal to noise ratio, you probably have 3 meg in the uplink and 5 meg in the downlink. You got 40 to 80 milliseconds of latency in LTE. It's pretty decent. You do a speed test on your device, you'll see that you're getting about 40 to 80 milliseconds. You take NB-IoT, and now you got a latency that's larger, 800 milliseconds. You power up an NB-IoT device, it's going to probably take a second or two to attach to the network, because the technology is simplified. So the throughputs are also lower. And then when you get into Cat-M, you got latency that's longer than LTE, but better than NB-IoT. And all this is the reason why you see this big number for extended coverage is when you're going to deep penetration, you're going to the basement, you're going through the foliage, you're going to have a higher latency. But you can always set up these devices to react in milliseconds with network settings, device settings. So a lot of knobs here, and all these together feed into the decision on which IoT technology to use. So moving to the next one now. Here, this is a comparison of just the two LPWAN technologies. So we keep LTE to the side for a minute. We just take NB-IoT and Cat-M, and you realize that when it comes to the way these devices are deployed, you've got NB-IoT and Cat-M usually in the same unit. And when they are in the same unit, then you have voice because Cat-M has voice capabilities in it. NB-IoT does not. So the combination has it. Connected mode mobility, well, Cat-M has it. NB-IoT also has some limited mobility, but given that you have Cat-M in this dual module, you can have connected mode mobility. Connected mode mobility is you got a device which is not active in traffic, you move it to another place and it reconnects from the other place. On the other hand, if you're exchanging traffic with the network, you've got an active data bearer, you're moving, and handover occurs. That's connected mode mobility. So that's the difference between the two. When it comes to NB-IoT, I think let me point out to another picture we had here. Let me get to that picture a little later. So in this picture here, the guard band is where the NB-IoT carrier, the 200 kilohertz, is sitting between two LTE carriers. So that is a guard band deployment. The in-band deployment is where the NB-IoT carrier is sitting in the middle of the LTE carrier. So that's in-band. Guard band carriers, when you have something that's sitting between two LTE carriers for NB-IoT, then you can use it for both these modem types. Device positioning in Cat-M is better. So when you need location technology, then probably Cat-M is a better choice. And this number is from, well, it's almost a year back now, since we are already in November, 9 months back. There are about an equal number of devices globally. This is a global number, which support NB-IoT or Cat-M. So that's another factor for making a decision. So then deployment aspects. How do you deploy these things, or what are the criteria for deploying this? So traditionally what happens is you start the wireless grid modernization process, and as a part of that process you have these towers that are real high up. So you got at a height, maybe a couple of 100 feet, you deploy an LTE network. The LTE network is reaching out to a lot of the smart grid. The green lines here are showing LTE connections. So you got MCPDT, for example, which is being served here for workforce management. You got reclosures, cap banks, and well, you got other devices, maybe transformers with routers or SIMs in them. You're talking to all these with LTE. Then you start getting into the point where the devices that have to be accessed are below the clutter. They are below the tree line. They're going to get, you need to, for ensuring your coverage, you need to bring your radios and antennas a little lower. So then when you densify the network and you deploy something at, let's say, a couple of 10 feet, maybe 20, 30 feet high, you're now able to reach the meters that are hanging outside your house, or you're able to reach a device that's between houses. And reaching such a device would be difficult because line of sight is not clear from high up in a pole with a tree line in between. So that's where this gets deployed, and you now have NB-IoT or Cat-M as a part of a densification. The devices here are at maybe a couple of feet off the ground, and the devices here are different. They are much higher up. So this combination of the device height and the antenna height is what makes a big difference in the link budget. So the link budget for this is different than the link budget for this, just based on how high the radios are and how high the devices are. So that's one approach to deployment. And as with everything, we always need to have security. 3GPP brings in a lot of security as a part of the model. We got a authentication and authorization process that is quite robust. With 5G coming in, there are new AKA types of authentication, which is optional, but carrying forward from 4G to 5G, the security concepts are fairly similar. And this is an aspect which has been considered quite seriously within the way that we deploy our networks. The security is on the transport, on the air interface, within the core network. You assume that the bad actor is within your network already. You don't protect with walls. You protect with ensuring that every device has an authorization to access the network from within the network. That's another aspect. So now looking ahead, when it comes to 5G, the way that Cat-M and NB-IoT have been designed, the concepts are similar, whether you're sitting on an NR carrier or you're sitting on an LTE carrier. And dynamic spectrum sharing is one of the tools being used within the industry for dynamically sharing the same amount of the same spectrum between 4G and 5G technologies, between LTE and NR. So without involving LP-WAN or IoT or anything, if it's just a pure smartphone world, right now the carriers have dynamic spectrum sharing, at least some of them do, where If NR radio comes into the coverage, it uses NR access. When that NR guy goes away or moves out of the area, that spectrum gets used for LTE. And now if another NR guy comes in, then a little bit of the spectrum gets used. So dynamically on a millisecond level, the network is providing either NR access or LTE access. Now you take that a step further and you apply the same concepts to NB-IoT or Cat-M, where in that dynamic spectrum, the NB-IoT and the Cat-M carriers and cells are defined, and they continue to operate with business as usual. What was working with LTE in a mixed NR world, it works. In a pure NR world, it continues to work. So that's the evolution story for NB-IoT and Cat-M and LPWAN technologies as they migrate from 4G to 5G. And then the other question that always comes up is, so what's the big deal with 5G? I mean, why do people keep talking about NR? There are two things there. One of them is that the initial access, if you take the orange line here, that is NR. You take the green line, that's LTE, and you've got this NSA in between, where you're doing LTE for control channels and usually NR for data channels, NR and LTE for data channels. So in the pure LTE world, you're probably looking at, in this graphic, about 150 milliseconds to establish an internet connection. Now you take that spectrum, you switch it to NR, make sure you're in the right spectrum, as in mid-band spectrum is usually good for NR rather than low band. And now your initial access is about 25 milliseconds. So to seize a bearer quicker, that's one value proposition for NR. And the other value proposition is that the core network in 5G is different. It's got more capabilities for network slicing, so you're then able to dedicate a certain part of your network to slow devices, a different part of your network for devices that need a fast response, as in low latency, and another part of the network for high performance, as in high throughput. So those are some of the flexibilities that you get from NR, and that's what makes it set for critical IoT. So we talked about massive IoT, we talked about broadband. Now we're getting into critical IoT because of what NR offers. So I guess in summary, IoT brings flexibility because you have different types of LTE technologies like NB-IoT, Cat-M, and regular LTE. You have enhanced coverage because the technology allows for repetition of data to allow for deeper penetration. The control channel structure in IoT and in NB-IoT and Cat-M is different and simplified as compared to LTE. So you're able to achieve more battery life because the resources that you're using on the device are lesser. And the way that 3GPP has built these technologies, transitioning from 4G to 5G is considered. And especially as energy efficiency becomes important, even battery life aside, a 5G system would or an IoT system would occupy lesser power consumption. So that is another positive. I think with that, that was my last slide. I'm ready for questions.
Gosh, thank you, Gautam. That was really insightful and deep technically. We do have a few questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible. For those of you who have not typed your questions yet, just use the question tool and type in your questions, and I'll just read them out exactly as they are. I'll do my best to anyway. So Gautam, we had a couple of questions really centered around I think, the cybersecurity of IoT. So let me ask you the first one. How do you see mitigating cybersecurity risk associated with the increased attack surface that IoT can create? And I assume, back to your note and what we're all seeing about the massive amount of IoTs coming on, IoT devices. So if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so yeah, the number of devices have increased a lot. What we would depend on is that the mechanism for authenticating and ensuring the security for those millions of devices is no different than what we would use for a traditional consumer device. So that's one aspect where the device itself at a SIM level, at a subscription level, is going through security checks that are robust. On top of that, there are aspects in the core network which allow for selective admission of devices. You can have whitelisting, blacklisting of devices. You have mechanisms by which a device is blocked from the network. So someone steals an IoT device, then you block it from the network. So those are some of the aspects from an end user perspective. From a transport and from a protocol perspective, depending on how the network is deployed, you might turn on IPsec, for example, to protect the connection from the base stations to the core. And on the RF interface, you have encryption and the protection of data between device and RAN and the radio network. So that's another area of security. So yeah, it's depending on 3GPP and its robust security protocols. I think that would be the short answer to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Makes sense. And we had one other from the same person, probably a follow-on or maybe just another way of asking. So it's okay to say if it's still the same answer. But what prevents an authorized but compromised device from saturating the network with the equivalent of a broadcast storm?
A denial of service attack from a small device. Huh? Yeah, that would be where admission control is a tool that's used often. Admission control is used both for priority and preemption, but it can also be used for security. So very often, if there is a flood of messages coming from the network, that's something which can be arrested by configuring in the core. So that's one way of doing the protection. Of course, if you know that a device has been compromised, you can block it from the network. So that is the quickest way of ensuring that compromised devices, first of all, are not allowed in. They're authorized, but you'd be authorized then, I guess. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. And clearly cybersecurity is the one thing that we all have to stay on top of all the time. And certainly it doesn't matter the network as much or even the device as much as human diligence. So we all have to be diligent and keep all of those cybersecurity functions in place so that we do as much as possible to mitigate that ourselves, I think. Excellent. Again, anybody else have questions, please put them in the question tool. And we won't go, over time, certainly, but we want to give everybody a chance if they have any additional questions to put them in the questions tool for Gautam. So, I think we're seeing, and Gautam, certainly you are an expert in what the utility industry, when we talk just from your clients and our members at UBBA, you're seeing some real questions about this. And I think that's what really drove this topic for a webinar. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the real world examples that you're seeing of how utilities might be considering the different options that you've been going over?
Yeah, sure. So what we have seen is that the first use case that we see that's non-LTE is really getting to be things like smart meters, whether electric meters, and what we have seen is that initially, because the traffic model that meters work with today are couple tens of kilobits, hundreds of kilobits per second. The NB-IoT as a technology is working. It's providing the necessary capabilities, and because it operates on so little bandwidth, 200 kilohertz of spectrum, it's something which easily fits into limited LTE spectrum. Like we have 3 megahertz, 5 megahertz of spectrum, you can easily fit that in. So um, NB-IoT devices are beginning to are the first use cases which are probably in place already. Then the question comes on as these devices get more complex, they start reporting more often, more frequently, or they start sending more data in the uplink. Then the speeds that you get with NB-IoT tend to be limiting. So here you can see the difference. You got 150 kilobits in the uplink here, you got a meg here, you got 5 meg here, right? So this difference is what starts driving the evolution of devices like meters from NB-IoT towards CAT-M. You might have demand response, which if you have an end device like a meter, which can also report on your charging station at home, then you start having that as another mechanism for communication. So in addition to meters, we have a couple of routers talking to traditional smart grid devices, which are also working with NB-IoT and CAT-M. So I think the move from LTE, which can do everything, towards NB-IoT CAT-M is driven by the device costs, and as you move there, then depending on the speeds, you probably will see IoT first and CAT-M next.
Okay, excellent. We have another question come in, and let's see if I can read it through so I know what I'm asking you for sure. Thinking of like the Anterix 3x3 spectrum, what would be your suggestion for the flavors of wireless to optimize the usage of limited spectrum? I'm not sure if that makes sense. Does that make sense for you as a question?
Yeah, I think the question on a lot of people's minds is, if I start doing multiple things at the same time, can I fit it all into 3 megahertz of spectrum? That's a question that comes up often.
Yep.
And that's where 3GPP technology, 3GPP driven standardization makes a difference, because all three, NB-IoT, CAT-M, and LTE, are built to play nicely with each other. If you, by default, you're using an LTE for everything. If NB-IoT traffic starts up because a device suddenly started talking to the network, then the NB-IoT carrier that you defined in that cell would then pick up, and the NB-IoT gets used. And when that stops talking, you're back to 100% LTE. CAT-M is also similar, where you got CAT-M that's sitting in the middle of your traffic, and when the CAT-M transmission stops, then you got a, let's see this picture. So here, so when the CAT-M device is not talking anymore, then you have an overhead with Cat-M, probably about 20 odd percent of idle load is there with a Cat-M carrier that's doing nothing. But that's something to consider. So the fact that these technologies work together helps in running the math to how much of Cat-M you want to use and how much of NB-IoT you want to use and how much defaults to LTE. The other thing which I would highlight is that in this picture here, you'll see that one of these is talking Cat-M. The other two are using LTE. So that's also an option there where you say that, I've got all my smart grid devices in that direction. So I'll probably configure those sectors to be primarily LTE. I've got most of my IoT type devices in this direction. So I'll probably configure this sector to be more focused on Cat-M and IoT. So that way, within a single site, it's possible to configure it in such a way that all three gets addressed. But it's not as simple as it sounds. There is some dimensioning that needs to be done, but the technology allows for it. So with limited spectrum, careful dimensioning will allow for use of all the technologies.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you for that. We're about out of time, and the questions have stopped. So I would just say, any final comments from you, Gautam, before we call it?
Well, it is a very interesting area to be working in. As with everything else, spectrum is a valued resource. Working in technology and capabilities into the spectrum available to us is always something for all of us to work together with. And so we're using a standardized technology like LTE, NB-IoT, or Cat-M, and combination thereof. We got a pretty good set of tools available to us. I think we need to work together and identify which are the top use cases, and then I think through UBBA in events like we just finished at PlugFest, all get our heads together and figure out what works. So it's nice to be a part of this community. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, sir, and thank you for taking the time not only to share all of this with us today, but in the preparation for it and in all of your work at PlugFest and with UBBA in general. That is the critical piece, because it's not one size fits all for any utility. And I think having partners like you that are willing to come together, open kimono, talk, answer questions, solve these challenges together for our utilities. I think that's what's really going to be the future of utility critical infrastructure. So I am grateful to you, and grateful to everyone who was able to join us for the webinar today. Gautam, thank you very much. Thank you to Ericsson for sponsoring this and for allowing us to have your time. And we will call it a day then, my friend. Hope everyone has a terrific rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.